China said it's not going to sit still if this huge anti-dumping duty is placed on Chinese steels to the United States, more than 75% apparently. So would you think this is the start of the trade war already between China and the US during this administration?
Well, the decisions to impose steep anti-dumping duties and anti-subsidy duties are unfortunate and clearly going to have negative consequences for China-US trade and the steel trade in particular. As bad these decisions are, I hope and pray this will not lead to a more generalized, broad, full-fledged trade war between U.S. and China, because a full-fledged trade war between the two largest economies in the world, will not only do considerable damage to each other, but also have a disastrous consequence for the world economy at large.
Sure, but think about it, Mr. Freeman. I mean, China, United States fight over something that is so insignificant. I mean, steel, how much really Chinese export going to the United States, accounting for a huge percent of the U.S. production or use of steels, and also tires, which is also a small percentage of the bilateral trade. Why the two countries would fight over such unmeaningful things? Is it worthwhile?
Well, that's a very good question. I think if you approach it from a strictly economic point of view, it probably isn't worthwhile. I mean, even if someone is subsidizing their exports, if someone is going to charge you less than they paid for it in a transaction, you take it generally as a rational consumer. The problem with steel or tires or these heavy industry manufacturing issues is that there are political components to them in both countries, and so politics frequently intervenes in the trade policy over these issues.
Well, even if there's politics into the play, we have to examine a little bit whether these politics are really put on the right direction. Previous cases, for example, have proven that saving U.S. jobs through tax measures is quite expensive. In 2011, tariffs imposed on Chinese tire imports to protect the U.S. industry likely to save about 1,200 jobs. But that total cost to the American consumers from higher tire prices was roughly $1 billion. In the same year. Consumers pay at least $900,000 to save one job. Mr. Pruitt, is it a good deal?
Probably not a good deal, but as you've seen already with this administration, they're willing to go to battle over 500 jobs or even 1,000 jobs that might potentially move to another country. So I think clearly they're willing to engage, but I think part of the issue in play here is that China and the rest of the world has to understand that this is going to be an administration that is more focused on transactions than diplomacy, and as a result, those are going to change the dynamics of the discussions between not only China and the U.S., but certainly other parts of the world as well.
But Dr. Hu, transactions, as you know, in the business world needs the basic element of certain degrees of trust, to say the least. If an administration put on steel, tires, and even the issue of Taiwan as a bargaining chip, it seems that the basic element of trust in the business deal is lost. Dr. Hu.
Yeah, I would be careful not to, generalize the issue here. Obviously, we're talking steel trade.
Explain,
it's complicated enough. Let's just address this issue, in a very restrained way. I think China has a lot of mechanism to resort to, also bilateral discussion, negotiation, but also there's a potential role that can be played by the World Trade Organization through the trade dispute.
Dr. Hu, I have to stop you over there because you talk about the World Trade Organization, WTO, but apparently during the campaign, President Trump, then President-elect, did not necessarily subscribe to it. So when you say China has the channels to communicate and to work on these issues, exactly what are you referring to?
Well, obviously, the President Trump and the administration, has made this, I would say, unsettling comments about the intention to move U.S. away from the global economic and trade order, ironically set up, by United States in the post-war era, which has obviously benefited the world economy, including the United States. So despite these uncertain comments, I think it's the duty and in China's interest and actually the rest of the world interest to continue to stay on track to preserve a more liberal international trade regime. And the WTO plays a very important role in that process.
Mr. Freeman, you have been working as advisors for foreign policy and trade policy for many previous administrations. I was also talking to a so-called advisor to President Trump, at least during his campaign, and they were telling me that he was doing what he was doing because he thinks China is such a good negotiator, and therefore he has to be all the way unpredictable in order to negotiate. But now he's in the office. Mr. Freeman, I know many in Washington, including probably you, has a difficulty of exactly pinning down what this president have in mind. But at this point, what can the government, the apparatus, and also the bureaucracy do in order to make sure that the two countries' trade can still work to a certain extent?
Well, you're right. Anybody who's trying to predict what President Trump is thinking or going to do tomorrow, let alone for the course of the next 4 years on trade or any other issue, probably doesn't know what they're talking about. But I think in general, if the trade disputes are limited to things like steel, that's actually a pretty good thing. I mean, let's be candid here. Chinese overcapacity in steel is a major drag on the global market for steel products. So despite the fact that you might think, and one might logically accept that these kinds of tariffs damage both countries, including the United States, the fact of the matter is that the trade remedy laws were set up through the WTO process. Everybody has access to them precisely to deal with this kind of issue. So one hopes that this proceeds through the normal channels, including, as Dr. Hu says, through the WTO.
Right.
The administration hasn't shown any proclivity to use multilateral channels yet, but it is a channel, and President Trump, if nothing else, understands the need for using every point of leverage.
Not only international channels, what about domestic channel? Would that work better, Mr. Pruitt? For example, over the weekend, Mr. President was talking to the member of his Business Advisory Council, in which multinational business leaders from the United States are being represented. According to Mr. Schwartzman from this Blackstone Group, when he came out of that discussion in the White House, he said this to the CNBC reporter, which is, the issue of China is being discussed thoroughly, and there are opinions from both sides being presented to the president, who was very active in the discussion. Mr. Pruitt, how much do you think this kind of internal mechanism might help the current president and his cabinet understand issues better and therefore make reasonable decisions? Mr. Pruitt.
Well, certainly in the short run here, it's going to be critical for China and other countries to invest in and engage in all of the various channels of communication, both diplomatic, formal, and back channel communications with this administration. Right now, as I'm sure your viewers know, this administration is still in the process of staffing up. There are a lot of positions that will play roles in this discussion that haven't even been filled yet, and as a result of the delays in filling those jobs, it's really critical if you want to get in front of these arguments and these discussions to engage in those back channel communications domestically through the embassy, through various diaspora groups that may be on the ground here, through the business channels that exist. I mean, there are many Chinese business people who have contacts and relationships with people who are engaged in various aspects of building this administration. So they really have to utilize all of those channels right now because of that infrastructure not being in place.
Mr. Freeman, are you worried at all about the fact mixing politics with trade issues? Is it likely to help the administration play a better card, or this is likely to shake the very fundamental of the bilateral relations?
Well, I don't think that the One China policy is a card one can play in trade negotiations. I do think that's a step too far. So I do worry in that sense that the administration is trying out things which probably are going to present more damage long term to the relationship than help get a better deal out of the negotiations. So yes, I am worried in that sense. In the broader sense, I think the business community is increasingly aligned around a policy that will push the two sides back together in a more positive and constructive way. But there are a lot of challenges in the trade relationship, and this is going to be a bumpy road.
It is going to be a bumpy road. You know, when it comes to trade, it is not going to work all right if one party benefits while the other is the losing part. It has to be a win-win situation. We all understand that. And therefore, it is important also to examine what does it mean for each other's economy. The Peterson Institute, for example, for internal economics shows U.S. GDP under the baseline in the full trade war and aborted trade war scenarios in the report last year. A full trade war, according to it, will lead to a sharp drop of U.S. GDP in the coming 5 years, while normal trade will ensure a stable rise. Dr. Hu, from a Chinese observer's perspective, you see the U.S. GDP likely to raise in the coming years, and the jobs has been significantly increased, in fact, over the month of January. Really good report coming out. You can't say this is the Trump administration's achievements. It's probably a joint work. So what do you think this eventually could mean for the U.S. economy? Is that going to be enough in evidence for both sides to work together? Dr. Hu.
Well, at this point, clearly we view U.S. economy as fundamentally strong. In fact, probably arguably the strongest economy in the world right now. You know, real GDP growth, you know, not as high as in the recent decade, but you know, it's respectable for a mature economy, a high-income economy like the U.S. Unemployment rate now is really at the historical low. In fact, it's full employment. So U.S., you know, has some obviously issues concerning inequality, but on the whole, it's a very healthy macroeconomic picture. I do think that this whole dispute on steel and the other trade largely, you know, is political. Presidents support the pace. Middle America, you know, blue collar, steel is really not a big industry in the U.S. in terms of value-added contribution to GDP, nor in terms of employment. But it's a symbol of, you know, blue collar, you know, job security, and is the support pace of the president. So I think, you know, it's natural a target to make a strong posture to show that, you know, he's following through his campaign promise.
Final points also from the other two gentlemen. Mr. Pruitt, you want to go first?
Well, I would just say much of the assessment that not only we're doing in the U.S., but certainly you in China are doing is built upon using standard or traditional criteria. You can't do that with this administration. This administration did not generate as a result of politics. It generated because of the business acumen and playing with anger, if you will, and marketing. And to try and judge these things and predict where we're going to end up using, again, the traditional metrics is not going to be fruitful.
And Mr. Freeman, we've got only 20 seconds left. Would you like to say a point?
Sure. I think the bottom line is steel and other heavy industry issues are important, but far less important economically than some of the other disputes we have, particularly in high technology goods and services. So I wish that we'll get on to those discussions sooner rather than later.